the supply chain crisis, and Biden's first Christmas as president. You know, we call this a monitor tree. Look, there's nothing under it. Wilkow starts now. Welcome to the program. I'm Andrew Wilkow. The supply chain crisis is a lockdown by another name. And the little people, they deserve it for daring to question the lockdowns in the first place. See, the socialist left hates the idea of you buying stuff, having stuff, working just to buy stuff they think is unnecessary. Christmas presents. They think consumerism is an ill that derives from an ignorant impulse, and a supply chain crisis is exactly the thing. Like the pandemic that will allow bureaucrats and Democrats to reboot the economy. You want that new car? Well, in a few months, you might not be able to find one. Gas prices? Don't worry. They've got a plan. Just ask the transportation secretary. We'll get to him in a minute. Add the current crisis to the border crisis, the inflation crisis, the gas price crisis. The Democrat Party is the party of misery. They thrive on it. Well, the misery of others. That is, the left believes that miserable people will always look to the government to make them happy or at least solve their problems, even the ones caused by a big, bloated government. Healthcare, transportation, trade. You know, most of the problems in those areas cannot be solved by more government because they were caused by the government in the first place. The problems start in the dark hallways of left-wing think tanks and academia. Then they worm their way through to the Democrats in Congress and the bureaucracies, and by the time it smacks the average person in the face, their reaction is, what's the government going to do about that? Well, it's a good thing, you know. It's a good thing we've got really smart, dependable people on top of the situation.
With 40% of all products coming into the United States of America on the West Coast go through Los Angeles and what am I doing here?
Is it Long Beach?
Long Beach, thank you.
All right. Sounds like he's got oatmeal for brains there, right? Give him a second to fix himself. Joe, you got this. Come on.
After weeks of negotiation and working with my team and with the major union retailers and freight movers, the Port of Los Angeles announced today that it's going to begin operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This follows the Port of Long Beach's commitment to 24/7 that it announced just weeks ago. So by increasing the number of late night hours of operation and opening up for less crowded hours when the goods can move faster, today's announcement has the potential to be a game changer. I say potential because all of these goods won't move by themselves. We need major retailers who order the goods and the freight movers who take the goods from the ships to factories and to stores to step up as well.
Step up? Oh, great. That's it. You're just going to do what? Run the ports 24/7? Did you step up, think that one up all by yourself, or did Pete Buttigieg, the boy blunder, come up with that one?
I'm really looking forward to Christmas. You know, when I think about Christmas last year, at least in my family, I was looking at loved ones on a screen. And this year, I'm vaccinated. Those loved ones are vaccinated. So it's definitely going to be different. Also, of course, Americans have more income to put presents under the tree than they did a year ago. We've seen extraordinary job growth and, as a result, extraordinary demand growth over the course of the last year. Right now, we're seeing really three forces that are affecting what's going on in our economy and what you're seeing at those ports, for example. It's demand, it's supply, and it's COVID. We know what we got to do about COVID, which is put the pandemic behind us. We're glad to see demand has rebounded. And then, of course, my focus is to make sure that we address any bottlenecks, anything that can be addressed in the short term on the supply side.
Where do we begin? Hi, Petey. I know you're really smart, super smart. See, we have a labor shortage. That means not enough truckers and port workers, just to name a few of the problems. You want to know why that is? Let's see, lockdowns, paying people not to work, add in insane labor and environmental regulations? Maybe you can read up on this stuff while you're sitting this one out.
You've been under some bizarre attack for taking paid leave by some loudmouths in our political system.
Look, paid family leave is important. It's important as a matter of family values. It's important to our economy. And one more thing that I think is maybe underappreciated. When somebody welcomes a new child into their family and goes on leave to take care of that child, that's not a vacation. It's work. It's joyful, wonderful, fulfilling work. But it is work, and it's time that our nation join pretty much every other country in the world and recognize that.
Okay, I'll be the loudmouth here. Do your job. What am I saying? You know what? Take all the time you want. Stay home. Then you can't do any more damage. Now, the Secretary of Commerce says that she's all over this. They're all over it. Working hard all day, every day, but it may go all the way into 2022.
I will say we are working it day and night, 7 days a week. You know, my team, the White House, Secretary Buttigieg's team, and we're starting to see incremental improvement. My friend Jim Cramer and I talk all the time about semiconductors. There's a lot of work left to do, and so we are on it. We're putting focus on it. We're making slow improvement, but there's no denying that it's a problem. I think we're going to be feeling these effects for well into 2022.
She's putting focus on it. I mean, she's staring at it so much that she feels like squinting her eyes. So other than that fluff and twaddle, and let's be honest, Mayor Pete isn't actually doing anything because he's totally unqualified, what are you actually doing differently? You know, I could stand here and rattle off headlines like why California's environmental regulations are contributing to port backlogs amid supply chain crisis, or restrictive zoning laws worsening the supply chain crisis, or this from MSN, quote, it now costs as much as $25,000 to import a 40-foot container from Asia, up from less than $2,000 2 years ago. But I'll focus here from Reuters. Headline, U.S. supply chain too snarled for Biden Christmas fix, experts say. Americans, already by far the world's biggest consumers, have simply been buying a lot more stuff during the pandemic. Much of it imported, coupled that with labor shortages, equipment shortages, and a lack of space to store that stuff nationwide. Kind of funny, they seem to be saying the opposite of the boy blunder. So Christmas and Hanukkah may be lost. What do they care? The only part of this they care about is the political optics. They don't give a damn if your kids don't get anything. And believe me, elite Democrats and their kids won't lose out on a single gift. Do you miss Trump yet? Shortages. They love shortages. See, when there are shortages, the government steps in to provide or subsidize what is in short supply. Then they get to control it. Pricing and distribution. Just don't call it the S word. Socialism. No, it's not taking another step towards socialism. It's just a new normal.
If you've been to the store lately, you may have been met with scenes like this. Empty shelves, from the cereal aisle to deodorant and paper goods, everyday items in increasingly short supply. Data from last week shows just how widespread the problem is. 16% of beverages were out of stock at the nation's grocery stores, 14% of snack foods, and 13% of frozen items out of stock.
Makes me kind of angry, like, why?
As they say at the Biden press office, I mean the New York Times, get used to it. Headline, the world's still short of everything. Get used to it. The great supply chain disruption is a central element of the extraordinary uncertainty that continues to frame economic prospects worldwide. If the shortages persist well into next year, that could advance rising prices on a range of commodities. As central banks from the United States to Australia debate the appropriate level of concern about inflation, they must consider a question none can answer with full confidence. Are the shortages and delays merely temporary mishaps accompanying the resumption of business, or something more insidious that could last well into next year? That's right, Mr. and Mrs. Peon. Get used to it. You know, the left in this country saw the COVID pandemic as a lottery win, a jackpot, a once-in-a-century opportunity to impose every facet of their agenda they could never get through the ballot box or even the courts. A mop-up of all things left, if you will. It's kind of amazing how fast we went from a government-ordered lockdown that became very unpopular to a supply chain crisis like never before. The holidays may be ruined for millions of people. So what do the Democrats at Vox have to say? It's time for Americans to buy less stuff. Quote, consumers have the option not to order items manufactured overseas to source things locally from small businesses or artisans. We also have a choice that eliminates the potential for shipping or supply chain mishaps. We can just buy less. We know that our collective consumption of consumer goods, from the creation of plastic toys to fossil fuels that ship them to our homes, isn't good for the environment. You know, I'm not going to stand here and mock that part about buying made in the USA. I'm actually a champion of it, have been for a long time. But I still believe in the free market and free trade. And yes, trade with China is neither free nor fair. Does that mean all you leftists are going to want to drop all those taxes and regulations that drive business and production out of the country? Because, you know, there aren't enough artisans working in those little Etsy workshops to fulfill all that demand. No, didn't think so. The hard left thinks consumerism is corrupt and immoral. They see capitalism as an evil. You ignorant Americans, you've just had it far too good for far too long, and that's not fair to the rest of the world. So now you need to be punished, or at least brought down a few notches. The rat race, the hamster wheel, you know, life. You can hear life is more than just working to buy stuff, they would sniff. You know, while promoting some phony intellectual notion of something deeper. These people look down at you. Of course, they deserve all the niceties, but you, I'm sorry. You know, look, we Americans were not designed to wake up in the morning and put on our government-issued pajamas and spend the day reading some little red book. We like our freedom. And yes, we like our stuff. But remember the giddiness of the left and the media over the reduction of carbon emissions during the lockdowns? We saw chart after chart after chart of just how great the lockdowns were for the environment, and celebrated by elites going on with their lives in their private jets. They've gone so far as to telegraph even more lockdowns. Headline, equivalent of COVID emissions drop needed every 2 years. Study, carbon dioxide emissions must fall by the equivalent of a global lockdown roughly every 2 years for the next decade for the world to keep within safe limits of global heating, research has shown. Lockdowns around the world led to an unprecedented fall in emissions of about 7% in 2020, or about 2.6 billion tons of CO2. But reductions of between 1 billion and 2 billion tons are needed every year of the next decade to have a good chance of holding temperature rises within 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius of pre-industrial levels as required by the Paris Agreement. And look, headline, soaring fuel costs, United CEO warns prices for holiday flights will spike. Gas prices hit 7-year high, soar to nearly $8 in California town. Remember way back in July, feels so long ago, when the Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, said this.
I think we will have several more months of rapid inflation, so I'm not saying that this is a 1-month phenomenon, but I think over the medium term, we'll see inflation decline back toward normal levels.
The foresight of the Biden administration. Here's again from Reuters. Quote, President Joe Biden is pushing to ease supply shortages and tame rising prices in time for Christmas, but unsnarling, the U.S. supply lines could take far longer, experts told Reuters. So here's the argument. The one thing the government under Biden can do to solve this crisis and maybe, just maybe, salvage the holidays is to get out of the way so the private sector has more leeway. And that ain't gonna happen. See, socialism thrives on shortage. The less there is, the more the government has to manage the resources. They don't want us to get back to normal. That's obvious because every chance they get, they increase the pain. You know, like canceling a pipeline and up go the gas prices? It's all part of the plan. It wouldn't surprise me if they somehow tied buying holiday presents with being vaccinated. These people don't have solutions. They give empty speeches about equity and climate change. That's not going to get the products from one container to one consumer. We are waiting for a bunch of useless, phony aristocrats in D.C. that spend their time throwing dinner parties. They don't have the answers, but they do have the power to make you miserable. More domestic sourcing, made in the USA. I'm all about it. I buy as much made in the US as I can. But raising taxes, increasing regulations, and killing domestic energy is never going to onshore those jobs, ever. From the president down to the boy Blunder, we are being led around by a bunch of people who embody the Dunning-Kruger effect. What's that? Definition. The Dunning-Kruger effect in psychology, a cognitive bias whereby people with limited knowledge or competence in a given intellectual or social domain greatly overestimate their own knowledge or competence in that domain relative to objective criteria or to the performance of their peers or people in general. That's every one of these useless pseudo-intellectuals we have running the show, especially Mr. Paternity. I said paternity as paternity, time off, paternity. The elites in Washington think we need a reset so long as they remain on top, a reboot, if you will, a new economy with a new class. You, however, need to be corrected and re-educated in the new green ways. Lockdowns, shortages, less freedom, less choice, more lines, more control. God, can we just get a big red button that we could all push and go back to 2019? Our first guest has a brand new book out, and it's not just any political book. This is, and I say this sincerely, a must-read. The Dying Citizen: How Progressive Elites, Tribalism, and Globalization Are Destroying the Idea of America. He's authored or edited dozens of books, and he's currently a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Victor Davis Hanson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
One of the things I want to get to straight from the book is you write about citizenship and discipline, and that citizenship requires responsibility. It doesn't mean what the Democrats and the left seem to think, which means it's just entitlement.
Now, it's a very rare idea, both historically and currently. I mean, of 7,000 years of civilization, the idea that people in a particular state or nation or empire would not be subjects or not be serfs or not be slaves, that's a very rare idea. And it didn't really begin until about 2,500 years ago in Greece. And today, we look at the 190 nations in the world, less than half are constitutional, and probably of those constitutional states, maybe another half lack full citizenship. The idea that people who reside in a particular country choose their leaders, audit them, censor them, decide what revenues, where the revenues will come from, how they will be spent, when and when not to make war, et cetera, et cetera. But it requires a lot of citizens to be active and engaged and informed, and most societies just couldn't do it. They didn't have either the desire or the ability of the citizenry.
You know, I love to talk about the Tytler cycle, and I know it's only attributed to Alexander Fraser Tytler, but that is that democracy, absolute democracy, collapses a society if a citizen believes that their vote is going to get them gifts from the Treasury. Once a political force has a majority of people who think free stuff is all that matters, well, then they're disengaged from what the government is doing, and the government can pretty much do anything to them that they want, and that is the peril of the modern welfare state.
Yeah, it is. That's the classic criticism by people from Plato and Aristotle to Alexis de Tocqueville, that if you allow people to vote on their own source of revenue, i.e. to them, their entitlements, and then they can also vote on where the money comes from, they'll inevitably tax somebody else and give the money to themselves, human nature being what it is. And that's why the framers and the founders were so careful that they had a mixed constitution of legislative, judicial, executive, and we have things like the Electoral College or 2 senators from every state to balance, absolute popular representation, because they were very skeptical of it. And this new administrative state is very recent. It didn't really start until the 1930s with the New Deal, and then accelerated with the Great Society, and now it's completely out of control.
All right, let's talk about some of the concepts of pre-modern forces and postmodern forces. You talk about the administrative state. Some might draw it at FDR, some might draw it at Woodrow Wilson. Let's talk about the line where you draw it and what the two sides mean.
Yeah, well, the book is divided in 2 parts, and I'm saying that there are always organic forces that will sabotage democracy. And one of them, of course, is the destruction of the middle class. You have to have a middle class to check the power of the very wealthy. The idea of Mark Zuckerberg pouring $400 million into selected precincts to warp an election, and the very poor who rely either on the largesse of the wealthy or the government. And then you have to have a space, a defined interior space where these customs and traditions and laws can be reinforced and inculcated. And they have to have secure borders. That was true of every state. No state has ever existed without a border. And then you have to fight this age-old pre-civilization primitive idea that you associate by your superficial appearance or maybe your religious creed. In other words, it has to be incidental to your persona. And so you're enriched by different vocabulary that enters your language, or different fashion or food or music or art, but you don't tamper with a core identity. And in our case, that's the American civic identity that transcends race and ethnic. And these were the pre-civilizational forces that always were opposed to citizenship. It was always a feudal system rather than 3 classes, or it was an open border and just wild migrations of tribal peoples, or it was something like Yugoslavia or Iraq or Rwanda, where people, deadly so, in deadly fashion, identified by their superficial appearance. But there was also always, and especially in our case, more germane to your question, of top-down elite pressures on citizenship. And we see it with this administrative, deep, permanent state, whatever term we use, the 2 million people in government, but more importantly, their leaders, the James Comeys, the Anthony Faucis, the Mark Milley's, the Andrew McCabe's, the John Brennan's, the James Clapper's, the Robert Mueller. People have never been elected, but they're exercising control in judicial, executive, and legislative fashion, all in one person. And they're extending, as we saw with Merrick Garland, way beyond their purview. And there's no way that we can check them, apparently. And then we have evolutionaries. These are the people. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that when they say elections have consequences, you're pointing out that these people wield powers and they overstep the boundaries of the Constitution. And it seems like no matter how we vote, it doesn't change anything.
No, it doesn't. And you're absolutely right. I mean, Mark Milley is prohibited by law from interrupting the chain of command. He's an advisory official. He did exactly that when he told generals that any policy concerning nuclear weaponry had to go through him. And James Comey said 245 times under oath he didn't remember about the very investigation that he started. Or, James Clapper, John Brennan, Andrew McCabe, they all lied under oath. There were no consequences. And that's new, I think, that the idea that these people are above the law. I think that's one of the themes of the book, is that citizens get mad for 2 reasons. 1, that they have people above the law, and 2, that laws are not applied equitably or symmetrically. In other words, they see people in the southern border coming across with no vaccinations, and as soldiers who may have had COVID and have antibodies, they have to be vaccinated or discharged. It's that type of, or they say, if I go buy a gun and I'm in Utah, I follow federal gun legislation. I can't pick it up, even though Utah disagrees with that. But if you're California, you can have hundreds of jurisdictions, sanctuary city jurisdictions, that said, you know what, federal law doesn't apply. We just snub our nose at it. And so it's that asymmetry that really bothers people. And then, of course, we have these evolutionaries. These are people who believe that human nature has changed so radically that they have to update not just the Constitution, but the customs and traditions that surround it. And by that I mean the 180-year filibuster, or the 150-year 9-person Supreme Court, 233 years of the Electoral College, or states having the primary responsibility for balloting in national elections, or even 60 years of a 50-state tradition. So for short-term political gain, the left is willing to junk all of these procedures and policies because it didn't yield the predetermined desired result.
I have asserted on both my radio program on SiriusXM Patriot and here that the Democrats have placed the non-citizen in ways above the citizen. As you just pointed out, that you have people coming across the border say, in order to participate in our society, you have to have a vaccine. Well, we know people are rejecting the vaccine at the border. We know that they are not being detained. They are being simply processed. They're being shuttled off into the interior and told to come back in 18 months or so a court can decide their fate. The American citizen, however, must follow every law, code, ordinance, and even in some cases, the exercise of fiat mandates that are treated, all of these things, bureaucratic regulations. We have 1,000 things on top of us that are not called for in the Constitution, but we have to abide by them. And then the non-citizen is given such space and leeway to operate in our country illegally. We treat asylum seekers, I'll give you this one. We hear from the left all the time that, okay, they're not migrant caravans, they're asylum seekers, and everyone has the right to file an asylum claim. Well, how could the non-citizen possess something that is inalienable while the Bill of Rights is under constant review by unelected judges?
Yeah, I try to point exactly what you said in the book. I went through the list of traditional privileges of being a citizen, and then I correlated them with a non-citizen. I couldn't find any that are left except maybe one, and that's the exclusive right to hold offices. As you know, the left is challenging that and said people who are illegally should be able to run for office. But non-citizens, illegally here or not, can be in the military. They're eligible for all the entitlements that citizens are. They can go back and cross the border. That used to be an exclusive right that a person, if you or I come into San Francisco or New York and we do not have a passport and we try to get into this country, we will not get in. And yet we're letting 2 million people cross our sovereign border with no passport control at all. I wish I could say that the second most guaranteed right, that is the right to vote in an election, was restricted to citizens. But here in California and San Francisco and Massachusetts and Boston, we are now allowing non-citizens and illegal aliens to vote. And then we go the next step, and that is, as you point out, well, if citizenship and residency is almost co-equal, and by the way, that's during the Simpson-Mazzoli Act of 1986 that gave these blanket amnesties. Only about 35% of illegal aliens took that option because they felt it was too time-consuming or expensive or a hassle. But more important, they saw no advantage in it because they said, you know what? We're residents, we're citizens of Mexico. What's the big deal? We have everything we need here as a citizen does. And then just very quickly, so when you say to a citizen, you're going to get vaccinated or fired if you're a federal employee, or you're in the military, you're going to be discharged. Think of it, when a military person is escorting somebody from Afghanistan on a plane, and the person from Afghanistan has no medical history, no vaccination, and yet the government is telling the people on that plane, you are going to get vaccinated, you, the U.S. citizen soldier, and you, the Afghan citizen and resident, do not have to abide by the same rules. So in some ways, the power or the privileges of citizenship are less than the non-citizen.
I only have about a little less than 2 minutes. I have to book you for radio where we can go as long as we want, because we could do this all day. One of the things I want to get you on is education. We're told by our elites that the American public is ignorant, right? The Constitution belongs to them. They know how it works. Yet they're also the ones running the education system. You're sitting. Are you sitting on your? I believe you're sitting in your farm right now.
Yeah, I am.
I've always said that the Constitution was not to be possessed by elites. It was meant to be read by farmers by candlelight. And I'm hearkening back to the post-revolutionary period. But we're not teaching, the kids are not learning this stuff anymore. Generations of people are not learning. You hear people say, well, that's unconstitutional. Well, where's that in the Constitution? Or I'm entitled to this. Well, where's that in the Constitution? The Constitution has become a catch-all for whatever people think should make them fair. They make something more fair or equal or nicer or neater or gentler. And that's the furthest from the truth. It
is, but I think what they don't understand is this was never a radical democracy. The founders said we do not want to look at the Athenian model. We would prefer the tradition of Roman republicanism. We want checks and balances. We want popular sovereignty, but we don't want mobocracy or what they called ochlocracy. And so that's why we have these strange things like the Electoral College or 2 senators from Wyoming that have far less population than 2 senators here from California. But the left comes in and says, you know what? We believe in equity. That's our new redefinition of equality. And that means equality of result. And anything that doesn't achieve that is therefore racist or homophobic or misogynist, and we have to change it. But what they never can answer is, why are all these people from the poorest, and I'll be very blunt, non-white places in the world coming to the United States? Why in my town are thousands of people from Oaxaca State in Mexico going 2,000 miles, entering here illegally, coming to our community and trying to be a resident here? And it's not just the money, it's the freedom, it's the security, it's the rule of law, it's everything. And yet the very elites are telling those people, you are in a racist, homophobic, sexist, horrible place, and they're saying, okay, I will mouth that, or I will agree with you if I get something out of it, but otherwise I'm going to stay here because my instincts tell me this is so much better than my home in Mexico. And so that's what they can never square that circle, that we're the most desired place in the world, and yet the host tells the people, you made a mistake by coming here. Because this is a toxic place, but they never say to the person, you 2 million that are coming across, you're entering a racist, sexist society. We think you got to go back to Central America and Haiti. Go back. It's not good for you. So it's incoherent. Please come here. We'll let you in, but it's an awful place.
Yeah,
and it doesn't. And they never say anything positive about the United States. It's all, we have to be absolutely perfect in the strict leftist sense of the word, or we're no good.
I do have to leave it there. I could go on forever. This is a must-read, sir. This is a must-read book for everyone watching this. Thank you so much for joining us. Victor Davis Hanson, we'll get you back soon.
Thank you for having me.
On a side note, news of China testing a hypersonic weapon was reported. And it was reported it could actually carry nuclear warheads. And this caught U.S. intelligence and the military by surprise. But then all of a sudden, the news died out pretty quickly. Well, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, made an interesting comparison to Bloomberg's David Rubenstein. Take a look.
There have recently been some reports that the Chinese have a hypersonic missile that can theoretically go into space and then come down with a nuclear bomb, escaping our ability to knock it down. Is that something I should be worried about, or all Americans should be worried about?
Well, what you saw, and I don't want to get too much into the classification of what we saw, but what we saw was a very significant event of a test of a hypersonic weapon system, and it is very concerning. I think I saw in some of the newspapers they used the term Sputnik moment. I don't know if it's quite a Sputnik moment, but I think it's very close to that.
Ooh, Sputnik moment. General Milley is actually the first official to confirm that the test even took place, which again, U.S. intelligence and the military had no idea China was working on this weapon that can launch up into space and right down on the U.S. and we wouldn't even know it's coming. Well, maybe it's time to get off the woke crap and enough with the studying white rage and start studying what the Chinese are up to. You got one job, buddy. One. Do it. All right, my next guest is running to be the next senator from the state of California, a state with more problems than we can keep track of. Elizabeth Heng, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thank you so much for having me here today.
All right, since you put the video up on TikTok, can we see the bauble? Yeah, she said yes, it said. So congratulations.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
All right, now onto the serious stuff. you put up a video which made me reach out to you that gas prices have hit $8 a gallon in certain parts of California. I know that you're running to be in the U.S. Senate, but that is going to crush the state economy. Whether it's the Senate down to local mayors, your state has got to get out from under the Democrats.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think what will happen with this upcoming election is that everyday families are going to see that we're worse off now than we were just a couple of months ago, with the increase of the gas price, the increase of our grocery stores, and just the devastation that has been happening here in California. I think enough is enough, and I truly believe that average, everyday Californians are just looking to get back to being able to afford basic things that we need, such as gas, groceries, and get this economy going again.
We have an upcoming gubernatorial election in my state of New Jersey, and one of the big issues is outbound migration. And look at your state. People are fleeing. They're leaving for Texas. Idaho has a booming housing market because people are leaving California. I mean, the state can't survive. If people with businesses and resources and wealth leave the state and they don't come back, the state's never going to recover from this.
And absolutely. I mean, if you just look at the census alone, California, for the first time in decades, has lost a congressional district based off of redistricting right now. And that didn't even account to the number of Californians that have fled to these places, such as Texas, Florida, Utah, Nevada. It's becoming so impossible for businesses to operate here in California, just based on the amount of regulatory burdens that our Sacramento Governor Gavin Newsom continues to inflict upon this state. The taxes are like the highest in the nation, and it's just the cost of living here. It's too difficult at this point.
I mean, housing in your state, food in your state, gas in your state. It's funny, we talked to Victor Davis Hanson before you, and actually he said that he lives not far from you, and we were talking about just how great your candidacy is. This is what's needed, that if we don't get real intellectual conservatives into the Senate, into the House of Representatives, and of course at the state level. I mean, you guys had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to have Larry Elder, a real conservative intellectual, as your governor, and the state passed. I see there's some regret out there. I see some Democrats are saying, well, I didn't vote for Larry Elder, but I don't really like what Gavin Newsom is doing. I don't see how your state goes on to thrive, beyond Newsom's flowery speeches, if they continue to raise taxes, if they continue to impose regulations. It could be the federal regulations, the state regulations. Your ports are snarled because of Democrats.
Yeah, and I couldn't reiterate that is what everybody is telling me up and down the state. Conservatives, common sense voters, independents, actually some Democrats. And so I really do believe we have this major opportunity that we haven't had in California to take the state back and have that pendulum swing, because we are actually, I believe that California is one of the best states in the country. And the only thing that's bad here is our government. And we just need to get back to basics. And I'm really excited about this race, about the momentum that we've been building, and having individuals such as you continue to reach out so that we can get our message out.
I look at your senators, and I look at where the power base is from, right? You Dianne Feinstein, Barbara Boxer, formerly Kamala Harris. It seems like San Francisco and Los Angeles control the whole darn state. And the rest of the state is left, is under the thumb of 2 or 3 major metropolitan cities. If the rest of the state doesn't rally around something else, again, all of these problems are going to persist.
And if you look at what's going on in places like San Francisco, like Los Angeles, the increase in homelessness that they haven't been able to handle, the crime rates that are out the roof, they treat the rest of California almost as like flyover states. They go from San Francisco to LA and ignore everything that's happening here, from the fires that are raging in the state to the water drought that we're having for our agriculture and our farmers. It's so critical that we flip California with this U.S. Senate seat, because we can't afford to have more bad California, San Francisco policies be taken to Washington, D.C. The individual I'm running against is Senator Alex Padilla, who replaced Kamala Harris and was appointed by Governor Gavin Newsom. And Senator Padilla is simply taking the same playbook as Governor Gavin Newsom of breaking the rules, and he's taking that to D.C. His number one priority right now is breaking the filibuster, and we simply can't have that. I mean, that has been part of our country in the Rules Committee actually for the last 100 years, and is part of the reason our country has been able to flourish the way it has been, so that we have these checks and balances, we have bipartisan legislation that gets through, and so we simply can't afford that to take more bad California policies to Washington, D.C.
All right, let me veer into that for a second. The Democrats want to get rid of the Electoral College. They want to get rid of the filibuster. They want to apportion the Senate. They want it to operate like the House of Representatives. On the filibuster, I could tell you right now, and I think you know this, the second they are out of power, the second Democrats are out of power, once they're the minority party, they're going to say, well, we need a vehicle to support the minority party for checks and balances. You had it. It was called the filibuster.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is what they did. They said the exact same thing when they were appointing judges under Reed. And then when power switched, and Republicans were able to utilize the precedents in which they set, they were kicking and screaming, saying that, this is unacceptable. And they would do the exact same thing with this filibuster. Our founding fathers understood, human interaction and the greed for power. And so it was so critical for them to creating the U.S. Senate, which is the only continuing body that we have in our government right now, to ensure that we don't just pass, we don't just break things such as the filibuster.
Yeah. I got about 30 seconds left. How are the polls doing? You have been saying nothing. I mean, the media can't call you a radical. I know there was some issue where they accused you of burning a photo of AOC, but with about 20 seconds to go, how are the polls doing?
I think right now we're building a huge amount of momentum. Right now we're going after independent voters, moderate voters, expanding our base, because that's the only way we can win in California. And I'm going to continue to fight for freedom and our Constitution here, because it's so critical to fight, to holding on to that for the future of our state and really our country.
All right, Elizabeth Heng, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to you being a senator. Once again, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, here we go. Time now for parting shots. And today's parting shot is at a little-known website called YouTube. In a Senate committee hearing protecting kids online, Snapchat, TikTok, and YouTube, the Vice President of Government Affairs and Public Policy at YouTube said this.
On COVID misinfo, we've removed over 1 million videos since we started rolling out COVID misinfo, and over 130,000 videos as it relates to COVID vaccine misinfo. So it's an area we've put a lot of resources behind to make sure our platform isn't promoting or allowing this type of content.
She's not even hiding it. They're not even hiding it anymore. They didn't even hesitate. They're bragging about censorship. None of this is surprising, but here we are. Wait, are we? We're still here? Have they taken the step? We're still here? Okay, we're still here. We're here? We're right. They're wrong until they take this down. The arguments on this television program cannot be broken until they take us down. Make sure you catch me on SiriusXM Patriot Channel 125. They can't get me there. From noon to 3 East, 9 to noon West. From Dallas, Texas, I'm Andrew Wilkow. Thank you for watching Blaze TV.